Hailey is an art history major in the class of 2025, and Rally is an art history major in the class of 2026, also with a history and fine arts minors. Through the art history internship class last semester, they served as our stellar curators for the exhibition, along with Hailey Perez. I saw you right there. So I'm going to hand it over to them to tell you more about the intentions behind this panel featuring our wonderful art history faculty from across the campus.
Hello and welcome. Again, I'm Rally and Hailey. Over the course of the spring semester of 2024, we had the pleasure of working with Carrie on the show Pathways, which is currently on view in the Joseloff Gallery. One of the concerns we had about the show and its programming was including our art history professors. As art historians, we found it important to find a way to allow our professors to display their research and work. In this program, we will hear about new directions in research, recent publications, and more, diving into the issues and ideas that engage these professors outside of the classroom.
Today's program is generously supported by the Howard and Dorothy Whitney Student Activity Fund held by Hartford Art School Endowment, Inc. and the University of Hartford's Art and Campus Program. We ask that all audience questions be held at the end of the panel, where we will leave about 15 minutes for further discussion. Now I'll ask the faculty, going left to right.
Why don't we just have them introduce themselves?
Introduce yourself, your area of focus, and we'll begin with the presentations.
All right, so I am Frances Altvater. I have a PhD from Boston University, 2003, which feels like forever ago. I am an art history generalist in Hilliard, so I teach everything from cave paintings to Christo. And I teach medieval art and architecture for the art school on an occasional basis. So my research is on baptismal fonts. That was my dissertation research. It was the basis for my first book, which is largely about how we take ideas about theology and put them into visual practice. And so particularly in the 12th century, there is a lot of confusion and attempt to organize and focus on the theology around the sacraments. And so baptismal fonts go from being not decorated to being lavishly decorated, like the one you see here from Kirkland, or Kirkburg. The other font that's up there is one that I had the pleasure to research kind of out of nowhere. I was called to authenticate a gallery piece that they had acquired and didn't have much background on. And so where that's led is kind of looking at the fact that it's probably produced in England along the Channel, and it has ties both to England and to France. And so part of what my current research is looking at in terms of that is how big objects, particularly large stone objects that are about 3 feet across, 3 feet high, actually are part of a very sophisticated trade route in the Middle Ages. And then my second book project, which is stalled for lack of time at the moment, but sabbatical a couple of years ago, 3 years ago. No, more than that. Anyway, sabbatical a long time ago, is about how we take ideas about theology again, and think about them in terms of average everyday objects, the objects that we would think of as important to our religious life. So things like wedding rings, badges for recognizing a connection to a saint, bread stamps, so you could get a nice pattern in the bread, and things like coffins. And so it's a wide-ranging, generalist look at some of these sort of religious but not made for the church objects. So, thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Zee Onuf. I'm in the art history department here. I've been here for 16 years, something like that. And I teach primarily, well, I once taught medieval, but have since been teaching Renaissance and Baroque classes as well as the history of prints. And it's been a great deal of fun to teach here. One of my favorite courses is actually the serving, so I get to teach bone cave paintings to Gothic cathedrals, in part because it's not my area of expertise, which is super, super specialized. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about sort of my trajectory as a scholar, to talk, I guess, about the way I'm failing miserably here.
Just hit the space bar.
Space bar, okay, thank you. To talk a little bit about the way that this one project that I've been working on has kind of morphed over the years into several projects. So these are the covers of the two books that I've published. The one on the left was published in 2018. The one on the right was published in 2022. And they look like they probably have nothing to do with each other, but in fact they connect. The 2018 volume on the small landscape prints came out of my dissertation work at Columbia a million years ago. But it has, focused, it was like a very, very focused study on this one set of prints. You see one example on the cover there, which looked totally unassuming and not particularly perhaps exciting or sexy. But I really got interested in those particular prints because they have been published, or they were, I should say, published over and over again. So one of the great things about prints and being a scholar of printmaking is that it's not a once-off. I love paintings, I love sculptures, but one of the things that fascinates me about prints is that they have a matrix that can reproduce images over and over, and in different contexts. So in that first book I wrote, I looked at many of the different publications of that one set of prints that look like they're not particularly outstanding in any way, but in fact what I traced was the history of that publication at different times and places that could allow us to see the ways in which they might have actually sort of had cultural and in some cases even political valences that changed over time. The prints themselves also changed, so this is one example of the set of about 40 in the set from the first edition, which was published in Antwerp in 1559, and then the fourth edition, which was published sometime in the 17th century, probably about 1650 or so. And you can see, I think, that the publisher went ahead, took that plate, and did stuff to it. So not only sort of reinforced lines, but then also added this whole scene going on in the foreground, which is, a battle scene of some kind, with horses and people getting shot and all kinds of high drama. And this happens in a context, right? So this was also published in Antwerp, but seems to reflect some of the changing political circumstances. Antwerp had just gone through a really, really long war and was perhaps responding to the ways in which the countryside, which these prints represent, around Antwerp had sort of suffered from or responded to those political and military circumstances. Later on, the print that you see on the bottom is actually not the same matrix, so the same metal plate, but actually a copied version. So these prints seem to have had something that was like so like meaningful that another publisher took the time to actually reproduce the image on a new plate, almost exactly. You can see there are certainly some subtle differences and the scale is slightly reduced, but that really fascinated me too. Like, why bother? Like, just make some new landscapes, right? And this one I connected to the fact that this was not only a later moment, this is 1612, but also a new place. So instead of Antwerp, these are published in Amsterdam. And that is actually perhaps related to the flood of refugees who left Antwerp and settled in Amsterdam and other parts of the Dutch Republic in this period of incredible turmoil and war. And perhaps, therefore, these kinds of images were especially resonant to people who had been driven from their homes and wanted to see these scenes from home once again. But in a completely different context than when they had been published 50 years earlier. So there's something nostalgic, something kind of retrospective in them as well. So that was kind of what I did in the first book. And looked at each publication and sort of charted what happened with it over time. The next book that I published in 2022 is actually collected essays that I edited together with my colleague here on campus, Nicholas Ely, who's in the College of Arts and Sciences in the English department. I had thought I was done with the small landscapes, like finished with those prints. But in fact, what I did was actually then return to that series again with a kind of new perspective or a new sort of vantage point, because I was reading a lot about memory studies and the way that memory works and the sort of theories of early modern memory. And so I used that new sort of theoretical lens to rethink the things that I thought I had known about the prints before. And that was actually really cool because you never really know what you know until you keep, so you keep your options open and you see what else emerges as you begin to explore further. I will also say that that project was super exciting because this is the table of contents. I'm the last essay, but you'll see that it's sort of a whole bunch of authors that I got to work with. I got to read their work. I got to figure out what they were doing and respond to their work as well, as did Nicholas, and to try to think about how the whole set of these essays kind of fit together in some kind of coherent way to tell a story about war, about memory, and about trauma in the early modern period. And it spans from the late medieval period to, my period sort of at the 17th century. So it really provided a very different way of contextualizing this very narrow subject that I had been focusing on in my own work beforehand. So one of the things that has come out of this is a new direction for scholarship. I'm definitely not writing about the small landscape prints anymore, period. Thank you, that is done. But what it made me think about was this idea of publishing and print publishers and how significant they were in this early modern period for disseminating not just art, what we think of as maybe, images, but also mechanisms of communication. Like this was the way that people got to know new kinds of knowledge and new kinds of information. And some of the big print publishers have been studied really well, but there was a lot of minor players, the people who only published a few prints or a couple of handfuls of series. So my next task or my next project is looking at some of these little guys who were publishing in the early modern period to see how they contributed to this bigger network of print communication and print knowledge. Because it allows us, I think, to look at the whole way in which both visual information and visual communication were developing at this really critical juncture. And I think there's ways in which this is relevant for us as we think about the way that the internet is sort of shifting the way that we understand knowledge and information and the spread of visual information and disinformation today. So this was another moment, an earlier moment in history when people were grappling with many of the same ideas. So that's where I'm headed next. And that's all. Thank you. Joy, you're up.
Okay.
everybody. It's good to see you. I know some of you, not all of you. I'm Joy Pepe. I've been teaching on and off at University of Hartford since 1988, so I'm old. And Sherry Buckborough gave me my first job. Thank you for asking me, and I just want to say how honored I am to be working in the Art History Department here. I love my colleagues. I respect them tremendously. They have your back. And every time I drive into campus, I'm very honored. So thank you. I come from a small, my professional life, I was in the painting and sculpture department at Yale Center for British Art for 12 years. So I come from a strong curatorial background and museum background, so I call it confronting the object when I ask my students to look at works in person. And then I worked for 16 years as chair of the liberal arts department in the small four-year arts college, which no longer exists. That college had closed. My own interest is in 14th century Italian art. That's my first great love. And I've worked on the Castellani and Pulci Chapel in Santa Croce, the Franciscan iconography. It's my favorite thing. But I'm a jack of all trades, as Zee knows, because I've been teaching. This is my 37th year teaching, and when you do what I do, I have about 21 different courses that I could juggle in Western art. So, but I'm going to surprise you all by not doing art history per se right now. If you're asking what I'm working on in my own life, oh, I'm sorry. I am working on a master's thesis in British literature, which I've been doing on my own time since 2019, one course at a time, because I teach 4 courses a semester, and I took a year off during COVID. One of the great passions of my life is 19th and early 20th century British novels. And one of my culture heroes is Virginia Woolf. But during a personal disruption in my life, I just decided to go for it and to finally enroll in a program at Southern. I'm a New Havener, so I commute a lot. So in 2019, I took a graduate course just on Virginia Woolf, and I published, or my article on the visual imagery of Mrs. Ramsey / Julia Child. I didn't have lunch yet. Julia Stephen, in the book, Julia Stephen was Virginia Woolf's mother. So I did the visual imagery of Julia Stephen through pre-Raphaelite artists who had painted her, like Edward Coley Burne-Jones, and by, I'm going to go here for a second, by her aunt, Julie Margaret Cameron. Julie Margaret Cameron was a great Victorian photographer, and she was the great aunt of Virginia Woolf and the aunt of Julia Stephen. I am concentrating my current research. How do I go back? There we go. Actually, my current research is literary with visuals worked in, because I'm in the process of writing a thesis that is due in May. So Virginia Woolf's one of my culture heroes, and I wrote my paper on the visual imagery of Julia Stephen / Mrs. Ramsey. It's an autobiographical novel to the lighthouse of the Stevens, that's her maiden name, family trip to St. Ives in Cornwall while her mother was alive. Her mother died in 1895, Julia Stephen, at the age of 49. And there's the original cover, which was done by Virginia Woolf's sister, the great Bloomsbury painter Vanessa Bell. So I have this great obsession about the visuals. I actually went to Charleston House where Bloomsbury lived and helped work on the restoration of it before it was open. And to the lighthouse. This is a lighthouse every day that they saw at St. Ives in Cornwall. And the house still exists, the Talent House that the Stevens rented for a little more than 15 years. It's owned privately now. And so my current research for the thesis that I'm writing is about Virginia Woolf's mother, Julia Stephen, once again as Mrs. Dalloway. But I'm doing some material culture studies with that. I did a lot of material culture studies during getting this new master's degree. I am investigating the presence and the absence of the matriarchal angel in the house Victorian trope for women, and also the sister of charity, considering how Julia Stephen and hence Mrs. Ramsay, the fictional person of her mother, was muse and presented what was known the feminine gifts, angel in the house of generosity, domesticity, caretaking, an object actually as well. So I'm working on an 18-page section in the novel, which is an elegy, not only to the deaths in World War I, but to the deaths in the family of the Stephens, and how absence, presence, and nature, culture are expressed in this 18-page elegy, and the material culture, and here, by the way, let me, this is Julia Stephen, the mother, earlier on, and later she died in her 40s because she was worn out by the demands of Victorian wifehood, motherhood, and philanthropy. Material culture I'm including in that are her shawl. In the 18 pages, her shawl's left in the house for over 10 years where no one resides there, and slowly fades away. I am working on her vanity set of comb, brush, mirror in the material culture, and I'm working on a scene in the first chapter, the dining room scene, where she is at her best at being muse and generous, but where her own mind wanders to her table settings and the little painting on the easel that she's working with. All of this culminates in the figure of Lily Briscoe, who is a female artist who is constantly being told that she cannot be an paint in the book, and Mrs. Ramsay tries to be the matchmaker or the bride maker, but Lily Briscoe refuses that, but loves Mrs. Ramsay. And the last paragraph of the novel is her getting a portrait of the deceased Mrs. Ramsay in a very abstract form of a purple triangle with a green line through it, and she feels great triumph in doing that. So that's where I am. But thank you so much.
Okay, I'm back now as an art historian. So most of you know me as the curator, and that's my main role here. But I do teach an art history internship class, so majors in the room, you'll likely come through that at some point. I do a lot of guest lecturing here, but prior to being at the University of Hartford, I've taught everything from Western surveys to history of photography and history of Asian art. And that's my specialty. I was trained as an art historian of Japanese art with a focus on photography. And that's what I'm going to talk about, today. So I'm just going to share a little bit about a project that I've been thinking about for 10 years, but I only really now feel equipped to deal with. In 2014, I inherited a box of things that belonged to my great aunt, a woman named Mary Halbig, who it turns out worked for the American Red Cross during World War II. During the war, she was stationed in Cuba and then Alaska, and then immediately after Japan's surrender in August 1945, she shipped out to first the Philippines and then Japan and then Korea. And this is just a few things that were in the box, some propaganda from both sides, like magazine and Nippon that she had kept, her Japanese phrase book issued by the War Department, which is super interesting, and then the object that I am really focused on, which is this album. Her personal photo album contains over 400 photographs, mostly from her time in Japan, which was about 18 months. I really love this photo. On the right, that's her on the right, and she's holding her little box camera. I think she had at least 2 cameras with her that she brought to Japan, a medium format and then a 35mm handheld. When I received this object, I had encountered lots of things like it through my research. I'd spent a lot of time looking mostly at photo albums from male GIs who were stationed in Japan during the occupation. And her album struck me as both very typical of this type of object, but also unique in a few different ways. Typical because it includes photographs of tourist sites, nights or holidays out with friends, and things like that. But then atypical in the sense that it is continually intersected with these photographs that I'm tempted to describe as documentary, because they just really remind you, they place you back in the time and landscape of Japan in the fall of 1945. Coming off of 66 cities having been firebombed, completely wiped out, and 9 million homeless people. It's really rare to see those types of photographs in other personal albums of this time. Because personal snapshots are not officially sanctioned, they weren't officially sanctioned by the occupation era government, let alone really by the history of photography. I think they raise a lot of questions for me about how we write photo history, what types of images and objects are taken seriously, what are considered authoritative, and what are kind of ignored, perhaps to the detriment of our understanding of how photographs circulate and informed people at the times. The book is really fascinating and challenging to me as a historian because you often see many different kinds of photographs contained in one 2-page spread. They're often arranged really idiosyncratically, and as a historian, I'm trying to read a narrative here when really the reality is probably she's just putting stuff into this book as she either prints or acquires it. And so just to give you, this is a really good example of the different types of things. On the left, this photo of a pagoda, likely a tourist shot that she took herself, juxtaposed with a portrait studio of a Japanese woman, likely something that she purchased and that would have been marketed to tourists or occupiers as they called themselves at the time. That is next to a photograph of the Tokyo war crimes trials. I have a really hard time imagining that someone who was a stenographer in the Red Cross was allowed to be there, let alone take photographs. So either somehow she was there taking them surreptitiously, or more likely, I think, she had a friend in the press corps who gave her a copy. And then below that are 2 photographs of bombed out Tokyo. A lot of people, when we think about bombing in Japan in World War II, we think about the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And most people don't realize there was just one air raid in March of 1945 that killed more people than the bombing of Hiroshima. And it was this one on the left, March of 1945. That photograph is one of the most iconic images of that event. It's the photo that appears in history books on the topic. And so it's really wild to me to think about, a month after the war has ended, this image is already being reproduced and either sold or given out to Americans who were there as a part of the occupation. And that's next to one that I think she took herself. So I think this is a really good reminder of how, we can't bring our normal assumptions about historical photographs to objects like this. And then this is the page that really stopped me in my tracks the first time I flipped through the album. 5 photographs of Nagasaki after the atomic bomb was dropped. I knew it was Nagasaki immediately, first because of that really barren, expansive, flattened landscape That is what atomic landscapes look like, as opposed to the fire bombings in other cities. There's actually a special Japanese word to describe that kind of landscape called yake no hara. It means burned wasteland. The second way I knew it was Nagasaki is because of this little gate that you see up in that photograph. It's called a Torii gate, and it marks a Shinto shrine in Japan. And it appears in one of the most iconic photographs reproduced about Nagasaki. This one taken by a press photographer, Yamahata Yosuke, the day after the bomb was dropped. Yamahata was sent there by the Japanese government, they hadn't surrendered yet, by the government to document what had happened and then get out. So he spent one day there, and his photographs were censored until 1952 when the occupation ended. And this is really important to note because history books will tell you, and when I was going through graduate school, this is what I learned, that unless you were there as a part of humanitarian aid or for scientific study, no one was going to Hiroshima or Nagasaki. They were, highly regulated landscapes at the time. I have reason to believe that she actually went there and took these photos herself, mostly because of these little, see this little, how it gets light in the corners? That's a light leak in the camera that she was using that appears in other photographs throughout the album that we know she took, mostly because she's in them or her friends are in them. So the question is how? How did she get there? She was stationed in Tokyo. How did she get there? Why was she there? And how did she make these photographs? The government can censor official photographs, but you can't stop regular everyday people from making their own images. So I think it's a lesson in the elusive and I think undervalued nature of snapshot photographs and what they can tell us about how information is circulated at the level of the everyday about really, history-defining moments like the dropping of the atomic bombs in Japan. So whenever I have time, which is rare, I'm really excited to think more about this object and see what I can do with it. Thank you. Oh, you're in the.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay. What's your name? How do I? Oh God, PCs. Slideshow. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Rashmi. My training is my PhD is in Islamic art history from NYU, but I don't really use it anymore. I actually just kind of look at mostly 20th and 21st century stuff. I'm also a curator. I work a lot, mostly in New York at this point, but I'm around the world. I have really different projects. My exhibition was focused on actually family photo albums, Carrie. In the 19th century, looking at the British Raj, British colonization in India, and making sense of photographs from British Raj in a time of incredible unrest. And the book that I'm writing right now is focused on these collectors of art who are collecting across these incommensurate, across some pretty serious cultural divides and political divides. In the 60s and 70s, again, during a pretty fraught time. I had some difficulty identifying why I was doing such different projects. And my secondary advisor, she was just like, Rashmi, I know what you do. You look at weird people who are trying to work with images and image systems in times of unrest. And that's precisely what I do. I'm really, really invested in thinking about how the everyday person uses images to make sense of the world, particularly when they're feeling anxiety and unrest. Well, I just distilled it to what do we ask of art. I think that we ask art to do work, and I think that work changes culturally, historically, depending on time, depending on conflict, and so on. With the book that I'm writing right now, I'm actually looking at U.S.-Indian relations in the 1960s and 1970s, and there are all these like major exhibitions that are moving across between these two countries. The United States is really trying to get in bed with India at this point because Soviet Union is also trying to get in bed with India. And you know, we've all heard that term soft power. Soft power maneuvering engaged modern arts in kind of an interesting way during this period. So I look at the exhibitions that the United States is sending abroad, and the ways that, like, you know, Jackson Pollock and Rothko, and these guys are like really, really, they're talked up in the Indian circles. And on the flip side, I look at the ways that Indian arts advocates and artists thought about art, and try to move art into American circles, and what claims they were making for themselves. Because the fact is, and why I love looking at exchanges between countries, is the stuff that American advocates were asking was completely different from what Indian advocates were asking. Yet they had to meet on one shared platform. So in that context, then how does art make meaning? And for these Indian advocates, this is only 13 years after independence, 1960. India gets independence from the British in 1947. So what are they trying to do with modern arts on this international stage? Are they making a claim for a particular claim with the United States? We are a modern nation. We culturally do belong. We have the right for self-determination. And the fact is, actually, we're asking a lot of the same questions of art in this moment of time, which is why I find my project really compelling. At least it drives me forward on a daily basis. I mean, one of the major questions that Nehru was asking, so this is the first Prime Minister of India, named Jawaharlal Nehru, and he's asking in 1947, 1948, and even earlier, he's like, how do we present ourselves on a world stage when were previously seen as primitive? When modern is only allowed to be understood within a Euro-American context, how do we present ourselves? So he's a big advocate for putting, like, you know, modernist architecture out there. He invites American architects in the 1950s to make sense of India and build these big, sort of wonderful cities. So he's pro, like, industry and promoting modern arts in the 1950s and 1960s. He's also belonging to, like, this really interesting moment of transnational dreams. All these colonizing countries, and one not colonizing country, Yugoslavia, they're banding together and saying, you know what, this whole Soviet Union-American divide, like, why are we caught in this tug-of-war constantly? How about if we band up together, we can actually make our own statements about the ways that the world can be understood. So people are actively trying to remap the world in an image that looks better to them, that feels better to them in context of decolonial politics, or decolonizing politics. So we have Kwame Nkrumah from Ghana, we have Jawaharlal Nehru from India, we have the Egyptian leader, Indonesian leader, they're all hanging out with each other and talking to each other. Later it comes to, and a number of countries are included, including Iran and other countries. This is called the non-aligned movement, or I'm formally not aligning myself with the Soviet Union or the United States. We don't study this very much in textbooks because it kind of like, it still exists, but it never really impacted the world in a meaningful way. But I don't really care about that. What I'm interested in is the historical question. What were these people dreaming in the 1960s? Before it was an answered question that India wasn't going to win on the world stage. Before it was an answered question that Yugoslavia was going to disintegrate. How were they looking forward, and how were they trying to catapult art onto a world stage when they're looking forward? What were their dreams through the arts? So you see arts moving between countries during this transnational movement as well, in the 1960s and 1970s. And I find this a particularly compelling quote. It's by a famous English theorist and historian and cultural theorist. His name is John Bridger. So in 1968, this guy named Mulkraj Anand, who's hanging out with the Bloomsbury Circle, actually, he decides, I'm going to create a triennale in India. That means like a mega exhibition inviting a bunch of different countries. But he wants to come up with it as a political statement. He's saying, you know, I'm done with the United States being the center of the art world, with London being the center of the art world. Maybe if we have a major exhibition in India, we can remap the world in a way that feels ethically better to me. So this is John Berger's contribution. A bunch of like awesome figures from around the world contribute to the catalog. I send my greetings to the first Triennale of Contemporary World Art to be held in India. It would suggest the possibility of escaping from or even overthrowing the hegemony of Europe and North America in these matters. Hegemony is a fancy word for domination. This hegemony is disastrous because whatever the personal feelings or ideas of individual artists or teachers might be, it is based upon the concept of a visual work of art as property. This is also while India is advancing its socialist voice. The historical usefulness of such a concept is long past. It stands now as a barrier to further development. The ideology of modern European property is inseparable from imperialism. So he's identifying European values attached to art with colonialism and imperialism. The fight against imperialism and all its agencies is thus closely connected with the struggle for truly modern art. So in order to make a truly modern art, you have to refuse imperialism, cultural imperialism, and the hegemony of the Euro-American world. I wish you clear-sightedness, strength, and courage in your struggle. He co-opts sort of like the communist language of camaraderie. My book is built around a few different case studies. Some of them are bigger, like looking at the first Triennale of World Art, and some of them are quieter. I'm really interested in looking at how middle-class people navigate the art world. How did the rest of us make sense of these things? Because typically art is given over to those who belong to the highest or the lowest of the echelons, those who live in excess, according to a sort of a 19th century mythology of modernism. But Abigail Weed Gray is a Protestant woman raised in Minnesota who is very clear that she knows nothing about modern art. But she also feels that the United States has completely lost its Christian fervor, and she's a devout Christian. And she's like, you know what, maybe the best way I can feel God and God's presence is with modern art, with people who are decolonizing. So she goes to India, she goes to Turkey, she goes to Iran, she goes to a bunch of different countries, and she collects art. And even though her collection isn't well studied, it now sits in the NYU Gray Gallery, where I once worked for a year, and it now informs American audiences of what Indian art is and what Iranian art is. So it plays a pivotal role in representing these countries to American audiences. And as we know, American audiences are extremely important to world art markets. So she's kind of responsible for this wonky category that I sit in of global modernism. She's a pioneer. So she's thinking in the 1960s, how am I going to create one world through art? How do we spiritually communicate across divides in a time of a supreme unrest? I suspect I've gone over time, so I think I'll end with that. I have a few more slides, but thank you.
On this specific recent research project. Oh yeah.
I think I already said this. Okay. I don't. You guys who know me, you know I don't need this. Oh, I think I already said. I mean, was in a personal crisis, and I just decided I needed to do something that really was for me. So I went back to school while I'm teaching and 4 courses to do this. And Virginia Woolf, I knew I would be doing something about her from the very beginning. But quickly in art history, I'm from New Haven, so as 13, 14-year-old going to the Yale University Art Gallery, I was overwhelmed by what I saw. And I wanted to do it. I also come from an Italian immigrant family, so I was proud of that. So I wanted to do Italian art. So my mother would get me all these books on the Sistine ceiling. So that's how I got into art history, and that's how I got to my present topic.
I was a curatorial assistant at NYU's Gray Art Gallery, and I've read all of Gray's journals, all 13 boxes of it, 3 times. And I absolutely fell in love with this wonky, weird figure. And she's so honest about her insecurities and her fragilities, and I love that. I want to write about someone who's scared.
Oh, well, then that would be most of us.
How did I get hooked? Well, I mean, I guess it started in graduate school, and I had colleagues who were doing, these really sexy projects, and I really liked the fact that my topic was really humble. Like, there was just these little unassuming landscape prints, and it felt kind of like me. So that sort of got me started. What shocked me was the amount of scholarship that had already been done on these ridiculously tiny little inconsequential prints. There had been a dissertation, there were articles galore, and all because at one point somebody thought that the designs or the drawings that were used to make the prints were by Peter Bruegel, who's a very famous Flemish painter. So there was this long trajectory, and I'm like, oh God, what have I gotten myself into? But then I realized I don't really care who made the drawings at all. And in fact, the first thing I had to do was establish why that wasn't really important. And it was the publishers that mattered. And then from there, I think it's just sort of spun out as a series of projects that build on projects that build on projects, one case study into the next, until you find that you have an entire career, maybe.
Well, I got interested in baptismal fonts just because it started as an art history class, independent study, and I became really interested in the fact that these are things that circulate in really tiny churches, and they're incredibly important. It was a determining factor in your life, is your baptismal status. And they change really radically over the course of the Middle Ages, from giant pools where you were, submerged into the pool, to infant baptism that happens, by the time the 12th century comes around. So I really got interested in the way they change, and that brought me into that connection. But I think towards my current project, it really has to do with the fact that I want to know how we express our own desire for the spiritual. That there is an institutional push, and that's what's in all the art history books. And then there are these sort of cast-off objects that are made out of lead or brass. They are not considered high value. They are tucked away in multiple drawers in the British Museum, and they're interesting for the way they circulate among people.
I was not hooked by my current project immediately. It actually really scared me. I was in the middle of writing my dissertation on ruins photography in Japan, and photography, made by artists, so something made by an everyday person. I don't know, it really freaked me out. It didn't fit, and I was afraid it would threaten the whole project. And it was only later on, also the personal connection, made it feel like it wasn't okay, and to use as historical evidence or something like that. And a few years back, 5 years ago now, I curated a show on snapshot photography, on anonymous snapshot photography. So I did a really deep dive into projects like Rashmi's dissertation that make the argument for looking at objects like this, and felt like, okay, now I'm ready to deal with this thing. But the personal is still a big question, because I think you always kind of project onto whatever you're studying or working on, and in this case, I really am projecting onto Marie. And so I'm thinking about ways to maybe lean into that instead of run from it, and maybe do more creative writing with this project rather than a strict kind of historical.
That's actually a really good segue to the next question. You are all obviously art historians, but with that comes the writing process. So we're going to kind of poke at that a little bit with you guys. What would you say the most challenging part of the writing process is?
It's challenging. Every single part.
So list them.
There's the fear of the blank page. There's the, I have a bunch of ideas and I've put them down and how do they go together?
Yeah, definitely the blank page, and the thought that I don't have any ideas. Hailey? Because you have ideas, because you're reading stuff and you're taking ideas in and you're thinking about them, but you're thinking, oh gosh, everybody else has said everything already and I don't have anything to add. So there's that fear, which is not quite blank page, but adjacent, blank page adjacent fear. And then there's just the idea that you have to make, it takes an incredible amount of executive functioning skills to try to organize ideas into something that can communicate to other people. And that's where it gets really challenging. I once had an advisor in graduate school who told me, you have to put, I think I said this to somebody recently, a sentence that only has 5 words in it in every paragraph, which is, a stupid rule. But it was because I was writing paragraph-long sentences, when it was just like, I cannot follow you at all with the river that you're winding through this paragraph. So I think also just like harnessing your ideas into something that can actually make sense to another person is a huge challenge. And like long things.
Everything that Zee said.
Yeah, everything's, I call my room where I write the room of pain. I do, honestly. So that tells you everything. In some ways, I say what Zee said, but in my own less professional language, getting the angle. It's getting that angle of what you're going to write about, because in my case, how much work has there been on Virginia Woolf, my current project. So it's getting the angle. I also hate to edit, but I know I have to. So.
I love editing other people's things.
Yeah.
That question does have a part 2 if anyone is interested. What's your favorite part of the writing process? If you have any,
Well,
although
besides
it seems
when
like
it's
everyone
finished,
is scared.
I love a good turn of phrase. I'm so proud when I find a good, I love expressive nouns, verbs, and especially adjectives. I'm an adjective person. So I love a good turn of phrase. I tend to be a little bit florid and lively in my writing.
I think that writing is a form of thinking, and when you put things down, AI bad. Which is why I absolutely forbid AI in my class, because I do think that I know that writing is a form of thinking. So when I'm able to commit words to paper and I understand that I formed a coherent thought, that's an awesome feeling.
I was going to say, with my project that I'm working on now, I spent part of my sabbatical posting on Facebook interesting things, because then I could see what other people were interested in, and it gave me something to respond to, and it really helped to sort of post, to push me towards writing other things. So that was actually a really helpful part of that process, because I had feedback. So feedback's always good.
I think on a process, when I was in the last months of writing my dissertation and there was no time to mess around anymore, I did this practice of waking up and immediately going to my computer and writing. I wouldn't even brush my teeth. I would just sit down and write, and found that I wasn't so self-conscious about what I was trying to say and who was writing, because I'm really bad at editing as I write, which is not a good practice, because you just waste a lot of time. And that feeling of just thoughts coming out without me judging them was really nice.
I think as art historians in the 21st century, we do have concerns. And one of them we want to ask you, because we think it's an important question. Why is art history important in the 21st century?
So I was gonna be a zoologist when I started college. So I've come a long way around. I also spent some time in a law firm, and I have always felt that it's about slow looking and being able to communicate things that you see, and that doesn't, it transcends what you do. It's, everybody sees advertisements and magazines and films, that we live in such a visual culture. Art history is tremendously useful for those things.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's the visual side of it, absolutely, and there's also the historical side of it too. So, I mean, I think many of the projects that folks have talked about up here today, we can learn from those as a way to reflect on where we are now, or the crises that we face now, or the issues that are particularly pertinent. And it provides a kind of, not like a solution, but a method or a model of thinking outside of the strictly sort of like institutional or political or something like that. It's that other angle that art can provide if you look at it from a historical perspective, and then try to bring that to bear on where we are now.
Really, everything that you
I have to make you talk first.
Okay, I'll say two more sentences then. We live in a highly visually mediated world. I mean, like, y'all, if you're on social media, you've looked at thousands of images today already. Thinking about the ways that images circulate, how they make meaning, when they make meaning. Again, how does art, what do we ask of art in times of unrest? That question is certainly applicable to the ways that we understand the images that circulate through visual media, through social media at this point. For me, I mean, to be honest, I feel so panicked about the level of disinformation out there that my classes are first and foremost about visual literacy and media literacy.
Yes, I agree. As a museum person first, it is about visual literacy or observation. I push that in my classes first and foremost. It's almost, in order to get into a work of art, you need to understand its visual properties. So description and expressive language. And as a museum person, you know, I had to work one-on-one with objects all the time. But it's just humanitarian. It's the history of humanity and everything we are visually, and that's what moves me. I also encourage you to observe. I mean, I believe that the average time that a visitor takes at looking at a work of art in a museum is 7 to 9 seconds, which is because you're going like this all the time on your phone. So this is, art history is also about patience and looking, and absorbing.
I really like what Zee said about the history part. I often find comfort in the knowledge that I have as an art historian. Like, one small example being all of the anxiety around AI right now. If you study the history of photography, you know this is nothing new. People have been nervous about being tricked by the so-called truth factor of photography since its invention. Obviously AI is very different, but I do find comfort in going back in time and looking at all these other moments and seeing that we came out the other side okay-ish.
Yeah, regarding, I guess, what Rashmi was saying specifically, when you guys started down your path of art history, did you know that you were going to end up here in higher education teaching the next generation? Did it just happen? Just can you talk about that?
I'll just quickly say, I went to graduate school to become a curator and then had to teach and loved teaching. So being a curator at a university, it's like the ideal scenario for me.
as I said, came to it from zoology, and I was an English major, art history minor in college. I worked for a law firm for a long time, so no, I didn't know that I was going to come into. Once I decided I was going to go to grad school, it was pretty clear that I had to pick either a research path or a curatorial path, given the way the department was structured. And so I was more comfortable on the research end, and that meant, you know, also knowing that I was going to end up in higher ed. And now I care a lot about how art history is taught, because I've spent so many years thinking about what is it that we want to teach, and how do we teach majors versus how do we teach folks who are taking it for a distribution requirement. And so those kinds of issues are new and different for me pretty much all the time.
So there's a joke in my family because my dad's an historian and my mom's an artist. So both my sister and I majored in art history in college. She went on to be an archivist in a library, and I went on to be an academic art historian. So it was in the stars, I guess. But yeah, but I think I was always drawn towards research for sure. It was just a question of sort of where that would take me. And teaching is so much fun, so yeah.
I came to this path through the back door a bit. I actually didn't know what art history was when I was an undergrad. I was an English and jazz drum set major. And I had huge dreams and had a path set out for myself. And I'm a college dropout a couple times over. I dropped out of my master's program at the Manhattan School of Music when I was 23. And I was really lost for some period of years. Then I think, I could be fibbing, I don't really remember the story anymore, but I think I was listening to like NPR, and there was some story about like the CUNY system having a program that allows people with like bad grades or no grades, in my case, no grades in art history, to come through the back door, and if you stay there for a semester and get good grades and recs, you can stay. And so I started on my path at Hunter College, got my master's in Islamic there, did my PhD at NYU. I didn't know that I would be a teacher. I didn't know anything about art history. I was just like, oh, I don't want to wait tables. Best motivation. But I feel really, really lucky because I am so delighted to be in the classroom. I love teaching so much more than I could have ever expected. So I'm grateful that things landed the way they did.
I second that. I love teaching very much. I was a backdoor person too. I never did anything when I was supposed to because I was too busy in the rock and roll clubs. So I've done everything in the most maverick way, I'm telling you. So that's why I think I'm a good advisor with students because I know what it's like to have different paths and interests. And I come from a family that was not educated. I'm the first female to go to college. I had no idea what art history was. I love literature, so like many of you, I had a lit major, and then I found art history in college. So it was incredibly enriching, and I went the curatorial field first at the museums at Yale. And then when I got my master's, I was like, okay, I could start teaching. And that's when Sherry came to my museum and interviewed me there. And the next thing I know, I was teaching at night. And so I've been doing it since. And I absolutely, completely love it. And I love my students. I really do.
Thank you. Before we end, we just want to open it up to the audience if anyone has any questions. If not, we have more we can ask. Julia?
Cool. I guess it's for the whole panel, but specifically Zee. When you're looking at pieces, how do you know when you're like content finding things? Like you find different iterations of pieces, but how do you know, okay, I can start writing about this, or okay, I'm happy?
Okay. I think I heard your whole question. Let me see if I answer your question.
Yeah.
So I think when you're looking, it doesn't just stop. You don't get to a place and you're like, oh, now I've got the answer and I'm done and I have to write it all down now. Because it's, as Rashmi was saying, the writing is the thinking. So you write, you look some more, you write some more. And I think that's what, it really came home to me when I wrote a chapter in the first book and then decided I thought completely differently 3 years later and wrote a completely different interpretation of the same images for the article in the other book. So it doesn't really stop. It's never like, oh, we're done, until you're just like, good God, I can't with this. I need some fresh, stuff. And I will say that between those two books, I then went and did a project on Rembrandt, right? So it wasn't like that was all I've ever done, because it does start to be maddening. But I think that idea that you can always come back to things and see more. That's the idea of close looking and observation. Can keep yourself open to those opportunities. Does that answer your question? Who else wants to?
Well, I will say that that's also part of the problems with writing, is that you start thinking and writing and going back, and you can keep going back as long as you like, because then you don't have to release it.
And that's where deadlines come in, and that's why we give you deadlines.
Hi, can any one of you discuss the differences between foundation courses and art history courses?
I don't think any of us teach foundations courses.
No, the applied arts.
I'll take a broader tack on your question, because I actually think that, one of the things that art history majors have to do is take some studio art courses, not necessarily in the foundations program, but in the art school. And likewise, all of you artists have to take a bunch of art history. So I think there's actually a beautiful way in which they can inform each other. So thinking historically, thinking critically and visually in the art history classroom enriches the way that you can work with materials in the studio and vice versa. So the more you have a sense of materials and processes in the artistic sense, I think also helps you to understand works of art that you're studying in an art history classroom in a really rich way as well. I don't think that answers your question, but that's as close as I can get anyway.
Aside from the art of writing, do you guys have any artistic, creative outlets that you may use to help writing, blocks, or just to get away from what you're working on?
I'm an embroiderer. I do fabric art. So I've started by making tallets, prayer shawls for my family, and now I'm working on a long-term project of embroidering the Psalms. Again, for me, that helps me think about how you go from words to images. So it's kind of related to what I do, but with a lot more pricked fingers and blood.
Lisa, that was one of the questions that the students prepared. I feel like they planted it with you. I think the most creative thing I do is curating, which is really enjoyable because I spend a lot of time thinking about how a visitor will walk into a show or a gallery and what will attract them either visually or physically to spend time with the work of art. So I think about sight lines and just kind of formal comparisons, not to mention thematic and content. It's deeply satisfying for that creative part of my brain.
I dance.
Competitively.
I do. I was rock and roller in the clubs, but I've done ballroom, and you're right, I did do it competitively, and I'm doing adult ballet now, and On Point is new, and I go, I do some recitals. I also really love interior design. I'm not an interior designer, but I get asked by everyone I know to come to their house and redesign everything anything they have in their house, and I seem to be pretty good at it, but I'm not, I wish I had more entrepreneurial skills, because I could make something of it, so, you know.
To directly address the writer's block thing, one thing that has been really useful for me is putting my writing aside. And when I had the privilege of time and space, I was sitting at the New School Library, and I just picked up a book that I had always meant to read that was entirely unconnected to my writing. I read only that and that author for a week, and my article finished itself for me after that. There's something lovely about the ways it makes you redraw the connections in your brain.
I'm not a creative, I guess I would say, but I totally concur with that idea that oftentimes your brain is trying to solve those kinds of writing problems behind the scenes, and you just have to take your foot off the gas and let that happen. Sleep a couple of nights, actually, and read novels or something completely different, so that when you come back to it, it's almost like whatever you were writing, you don't even recognize it as your own writing, and then you can pick it up anew, and that can be really refreshing as well.
It's two.
It's two.
Yeah.
Okay.
Should we finish with one more? Thank you all for coming, and thank you to the panelists. We had a lot of fun listening to what you're up to outside of school. Outside of school.
We do have a couple more programs for the Pathways show that is going on in Joseloff, which you should go see today. It is open. But on October 25th, we're gonna have a jazz night. On November 14th, we're gonna have a poetry reading. Those will both be in Joseloff, and